Do you ever hear me, John? Anna's voice cut sharply through the morning silence. Plates clinked in the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with a tension that seemed to hang in the air thicker than fog. John, his jaw set and his eyes blank, set his cup down on the table. But how much is it? The same thing every day, Anna. His voice was cold like an icy wind. Their 17-year-old son, Nick, stood in the kitchen doorway, silently watching another act of the family drama he knew by heart. Maybe we can do without this circus for today? He muttered, leaning against the doorframe. It's none of your business, Nick! John snapped, without even turning around. Yeah, as usual, Nick snorted. I just live here, in your theater of scandals. Anna looked back at her son, guilt flashing in her eyes. Nick, she began, but the boy just shook his head dismissively. You're just destroying everything that's left, he said, and disappeared into the hallway, slamming the door to his room. Left alone, they were silent. There was more shouting in that silence than in their words. John was the first to break the silence. We were different once. His voice was hoarse and tired. Yes, Anna replied, but now we are just fragments. And somewhere behind the door, Nick, pressing his headphones to his ears to drown it all out, was thinking, what if I just disappear from their lives? Will they notice? His fingers were mechanically scrolling through his phone. A message from a friend was already waiting. I'm waiting outside your house. Hurry up. Nick threw his backpack over his shoulder and left the house without saying goodbye. Behind him, screams grew fainter and fainter, as if they belonged to strangers. Finally, man, came a voice from the side. Max was standing near the sidewalk, his best friend with childhood. Again, morning. Show. Yeah, Nick waved his hand. As usual. They didn't even notice I left. Max squinted, sighing. Listen, brother, aren't you tired of all this? The same scenes, the same script. Maybe it's time to change something? Nick stopped, clutching the strap of his backpack. A shadow flashed in his eyes, perhaps a mixture of anger and fatigue. You have no idea how much... Max threw down the car keys. Want to miss a couple? Let's take a walk, far away? Nick hesitated. College, responsibilities. But what did they mean when everything at home had been falling apart for a long time? Let's go, he said sharply. Let's see if anyone notices my absence. The car door slammed shut, and the car disappeared around the corner. And at home, behind the walls that had heard so much, the argument continued. But neither parent had noticed that Nick had disappeared. A dull beat echoed in the car, low, vibrating, as if reflecting the rhythm of Nick's thoughts. He sat looking out the window, where trees and roads and signs flickered, but everything seemed blurry. Inside was empty and cold. You're tense, brother, Max broke the silence, glancing at him from the side. I see. Nick just sighed, not taking his eyes off the road. Do you want to relax? Max smiled faintly and held out his hand. There was a small white pill in his palm. This will help. Seriously. You'll forget all this shit for a few hours, at least. Nick froze. His fingers twitched slightly. What is this? It's okay. It'll just take your mind off things for a bit. Don't worry, I've tried it too. Max winked. Nick stared at the pill. Small, inconspicuous, but it seemed heavier than everything he carried in his head. His ears were buzzing with tension. Arguments, broken words, disappointments. Everything he wanted to shut out. Come on, man, this isn't forever, Max insisted gently. What if... Nick swallowed the lump in his throat. What if I can't stop? You can do it. You're strong. It's just a break. The seconds seemed like an eternity. Finally, Nick reached out and took the pill, feeling its coolness in his palm. He stared at it as if the decision of his life was before him. Your decision, brother? Max said quietly, returning his gaze to the road. Nick felt his heart pounding in his chest. One thought kept running through his mind. What if this was my way out of what was suffocating me? And then his hand slowly rose to his lips. Nick kept his eyes on the pill, as if trying to peer into its essence. Then, with a sudden movement, he dropped it onto his tongue and swallowed, tasting it bitterly for a second. There you go, Max said, glancing at him quickly. Now just relax. It'll get easier soon. The car flew along the track, and the music became deeper and more voluminous, as if vibrations were passing through his body. At first, Nick felt nothing, only the same ball of heaviness inside. But after a few minutes, the world began to change. How are you, brother? Max smiled, watching him. Nick's voice surrendered alien to him. I feel like everything is moving away. And indeed, the tension that had been gnawing at him from within was receding, melting like snow in the sun. The pain, the anger, the resentment, everything became distant and unimportant. It was as if he had floated out of his own body, leaving his problems behind. You see, Max said, tapping his fingers lightly on the steering wheel to the beat of the music. You needed this. But with the relief came another feeling, cold, clammy, creeping. It was as if he were hovering over a black abyss. His fingers trembled and his chest tightened as if the air suddenly became scarce. Hey! Nick's voice suddenly broke off. What's wrong with me? My eyes widened, my heart pounded. It's okay, man. It's just the first wave, Max said, but there was tension in his voice. Nick grabbed the edge of his seat. The world around him began to warp. Voices became loud and harsh, and then darkness flooded everything. The last thing he heard was Max shouting his name in fear. Nick! Hey, Nick, hold on! And then came the emptiness, darkness. It embraced Nick, thick, heavy, without edge or end. There was no pain or sound in it, only formless darkness. And suddenly, a voice, distant, trembling. Nick. It seemed like a whisper from deep within. His eyes snapped open. The world came back in pieces, blinding light, blurred outlines. He lay on the seat, and Max leaned over him, his face pale, fear in every feature. Dude, can you hear me? Max shook his shoulders. You passed out for a few minutes, I thought. Damn. Nick tried to say something, but his tongue was heavy as a stone. His head was buzzing, his heart was beating wildly. The picture before his eyes twitched, now merging into spots, now suddenly becoming too clear. What is wrong with me? Nick barely managed to gasp. I told you it would be okay. Max ran a hand through his hair nervously. It's just a little stronger than I thought. A little? Nick's voice broke, and a cold sweat ran down his back. You gave me this without even knowing what it was. Max looked away. I tried it myself, but damn, you must have a different reaction. Nick's chest was burning. There was not only fear, but also anger. He wanted to shout, but he suddenly noticed something is wrong. World still around was strange. The sounds came loudly, then abruptly disappeared. And somewhere, on the edge of consciousness, a voice cut through. What if you never come back? Nick sat up abruptly, clutching his head. Nick, are you okay? Max looked scared, but Nick wasn't listening to him anymore. His brain seemed to have gone haywire. Max's face twisted into some bizarre grimace, and behind him, instead of a windshield, darkness, the same as when he had passed out. Get me out of here, Nick whispered. I'm sick. Max jerked the key in the ignition. The car sped away. The wheels spun. They crunched and grabbed the asphalt, flickered road signs, but for Nick, all of this, it was like a nightmare. Just a little longer. Max whispered, There's an abandoned motel outside the city. You can rest there. A motel? Nick tried to gather his thoughts. Why not a hospital? Are you crazy? Max growled. If the hospital finds out you're under this, you'll have problems, and I'll have even more. Nick felt a chill stir in his chest. This day, in a moment, everything was spinning out of control. Stop the car, he muttered. Nick, calm down, Max replied nervously. Everything will be fine. Stop the car, damn it! Nick suddenly shouted and grabbed the steering wheel. Nick was barely able to hold on, his head heavy and his heart pounding like crazy. The world slowed down and then surged, making him clutch the edge of his seat. Just a little longer, brother, Max said, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. We'll go to Dan's. He lives nearby. You can rest there. Dan, Nick muttered, trying to concentrate. Why? He's just messing around with things like that. Everything will be fine. The car sped along a narrow country road until it finally stopped in front of an old house with peeling shutters. Max jumped out first and rushed to the passenger door. Come on, Nick, hold on. Nick staggered out of the car. His legs were numb. The world before his eyes was now narrowing, now expanding sharply. Dan was already standing in the doorway, a tall guy in sweatpants and old jeans. His eyes turned instantly serious when he saw Nick's condition. What did you give him, Max? Dan's voice was sharp as a blade. Just, Max hesitated, a pill to help him relax. Are you stupid? Dan growled, grabbing Nick by the arm. Get him here, quick! They led Nick inside and laid him on a worn sofa. The room smelled of coffee and smoke. Playing cards and empty energy drink cans were scattered on the table. Nick, can you hear me? Dan's voice came from afar. I hear, Nick whispered, his breathing quickened. Everything is so strange. It'll pass, Dan reassured him, placing a cool, wet cloth on his forehead. The main thing is not to panic. You just have to get through this. Max walked nervously around the room. His hands were shaking. Dan, is he going to be okay? His voice sounded genuine fear for the first time. If you don't do any more stupid things, you will, Dan replied sternly. But man, you really screwed up. This could be his last rest. Nick slowly closed his eyes, feeling his frantic heartbeat gradually slow down. He was shaking from the cold and burning from the inside at the same time. But most importantly, there was silence again inside. Not oppressive, like at home. And the other one was empty, as if everything in his world had stopped. You're a fool, Max, he barely whispered. I just wanted for them to notice that I existed. Max sank to the floor next to the couch and ran his hands over his face. Sorry, brother. I thought it would be easier this way. Dan shook his head. Easier? Is that what you call easier? His voice was cold. Nick, remember this day, because not everyone gets a second chance. A deep silence fell in the room. But it was a different kind of silence. There was no despair in it. Only a hard lesson and a bitter truth. Nick lay on the couch, feeling his body gradually lets go tension. The buzzing in my head became quieter, but within left, something worse than pain is emptiness. How are you? Dan asked quietly, sitting down next to him. I don't know. Nick looked at the ceiling. It's like he came back from some black abyss. Max stood aside, leaning against the wall, silent and guilty. I'm sorry, brother, he finally said. I really didn't want it to happen like this. But it's my own fault, Nick's voice was hoarse. I agreed, because I didn't know how else. To escape from them. Dan looked at him carefully. Running away from the pain within you is a path to nowhere. Believe me, I've seen it more than once. Nick glanced at his friend. You've always been strong. Dan smiled, but there was more bitterness in his smile than joy. Everyone has their cracks. It's just that not everyone shows them. Silence enveloped the room again, but it was no longer as stifling as at home. What now? Nick asked, looking up at the ceiling. First you rest, Dan replied. Then, you decide what you want to change. But man, his voice turned serious, don't do that again. Don't let this emptiness control you. Nick closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. Okay. Meanwhile, at home, Anna walked from room to room, feeling anxiety creeping in. Is increasing. John, have you seen Nick? Her voice was tense. John put the phone down and looked at his wife with noticeable irritation. No, he probably went to college. His backpack is here, she said, pointing to the bag by the door. And he forgot his phone. John frowned. Maybe he went to see Max? They're often together. But why without a phone? Anna's voice was filled with undisguised fear. John, I'm feeling bad. Premonition. John was silent for a moment, then stood up. I'll call Max. In a few minutes, the bell cut through the silence of the night. Max looked at the screen and saw the name. Nick's father. His heart sank. Damn, it's his old one, he whispered, showing the phone to Dan. Take it, Dan said firmly. It's better to tell the truth. Max took a deep breath and pressed receive. Hello? Max, this is John. Do you have a nickname? Max swallowed, feeling his throat dry. Yes, he's here, but something happened. What happened? John's voice rose sharply, and there was no longer any of his usual cold aloofness in it. He was feeling unwell, but he's better now. Listen, maybe you should come over. There was a pause on the other end. Then John replied briefly, We are leaving. In half an hour, the door creaked open and Anna and John appeared in the doorway. Anna's gaze immediately found Nick, who was sitting on the couch, pale, exhausted, but alive. Nick! Her voice broke and she rushed to him, hugging him tightly as if afraid to let go. Nick froze. He hadn't expected warmth. He hadn't expected such fear in her voice. "Mom," he barely managed to say. John stood nearby, clenching his fists as if fighting with himself. Then he said dully, "You scared us, son." Nick looked at his father. There was no anger in his eyes. There was only guilt. Nick's voice trembled. "I just didn't know how to shout at you." Anna walked away, her eyes shining with tears. "Forgive us. We were so busy arguing that we forgot to hear you." John sighed heavily, and his gaze finally showed what Nick had been waiting for, understanding. "It's our fault too, son, but we can fix it, if you let us." Nick was silent, feeling the stone he had carried for so long gradually disintegrate in his chest. "I want for us to try," he said finally, "together." And for the first time in a long time, light appeared in the cracks of the mirror. A few months passed. A lot had changed since Nick had been on the edge. The Miller family had begun to work on their relationship. John had been working less, and Anna had been trying to spend more time with their son. They had even started going to family therapy. It seemed that the cracks that had separated them were gradually healing. But one day, Nick was returning home through the park, where it is barely audible the fountain was running, and the smell of freshly cut grass was there. His thoughts were far away, of training, of college, of how things were finally starting to get better at home. Suddenly, he noticed her, on the other side of the park, near the cafe with a terrace. Mom. She was standing next to a black car, and next to her was a man. A stranger. Tall, well-dressed, with a slight smile on his face. They were talking close, too close. Nick froze. His heart sank, but his brain was still trying to find an explanation. Could it be a colleague? An old friend? And then he saw. She kissed him. Not friendly. Really. Warm. Tender. Like I hadn't looked at my father in a long time. A cold wave passed through Nick's body. Everything inside him shook, as if the ground had disappeared from under his feet. The world around him lost its sound. Only the dull pounding of his own heart and the feeling of something strangling him from within remained. After the kiss, she smiled at the man, opened the door, and got in. The engine roared and the car sped away, leaving only a trail of headlights on the evening road. Nick stood still, his hands shaking. What was that? The thought pierced my mind. The pain hit sharply and deeply. They said they were trying, that the family could still be saved. Mom! A muffled whisper escaped from her parched lips, but she was gone. At home, the door slammed shut, shaking the walls. Nick burst into the hallway, dropping his backpack to the floor. His heart was pounding. Images of that kiss, that betrayal, that lie were playing in his head. Nick? His father's voice came from the kitchen. John appeared in the doorway, a mug of coffee in his hand, but when he saw his son's expression, he frowned. What happened? Nick stopped, breathing heavily, his eyes shining with rage and pain. Dad, he said, his voice trembling treacherously. She's lying to you. John raised his eyebrows sharply. What are you talking about? Nick swallowed the lump in his throat. I saw Mom. She was with another man. They were kissing. The mug slipped from John's hand and shattered on the floor. A dead silence filled the room, louder than the scream. John looked at his son, and in his eyes gradually appeared what Nick did not want to see. Pain, anger, and terrible understanding. Are you sure? His voice was hoarse and cold like a knife blade. I saw it with my own eyes, Nick whispered. She didn't even notice me. John looked down, his jaw set so hard that his cheekbones were shadowed. His fingers clenched into fists nervously. Damn, escaped his lips. Then he raised his head to his son, and another emotion appeared in his eyes. Concern. Nick, I'm sorry you saw that. Nick stood there, not knowing what to feel. He was shaking with tension. Dad, what now? John was silent for a few seconds. Then he said dully, Now we're telling the truth, and we're looking her in the eye. Suddenly there was a sound at the door, a key in the lock. The door opened. Anna returned home. The door opened, and Anna appeared in the doorway. She saw John and Nick both tense, their eyes heavy, staring at her. What happened? She asked, feeling the tension fill the room. John was silent, his eyes cold and his jaw tense. Nick couldn't resist first. Where have you been, Mom? Anna frowned slightly at the unexpected tone, but replied in an even voice. At work? Then I stopped by to congratulate my boss. It's his birthday today. The boss? Nick's voice trembled with rage. I saw everything, Mom! You kissed! Anna suddenly felt the blood drain from her face. What did you say? Her voice trembled slightly. I saw you in the park, Nick said sharply. Don't lie to me! Anna closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. Then she answered firmly, Nick, it's not what you thought. She took a deep breath. It's really my boss, Robert. It's his birthday today. We met in the cafe. I congratulated him. And that gesture you saw. She paused for a second, looking her son straight in the eyes. It was a brief, friendly thank you. He suddenly leaned over. And that was it. Why did you go together? Nick snapped, not looking away. He offered to give me a ride home. I agreed, she replied calmly. Nick, that's all. You just imagined it. Did you see it? Nick's voice broke. Mom, I saw it! You saw it for a moment, she replied firmly. But her voice was not angry. It was more like fatigue. But I didn't know the context. Nick stood there, clenching his fists. Everything was mixed in his head. Doubts, resentment, fear. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to. But the image of that kiss burned in his memory. Then John's voice came out, cold but balanced. Anna. He looked at her as if trying to see beyond her words. Is that true? She turned to him and, without looking away, said, Yes, it's true. I didn't do anything to betray our family. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Nick looked at his mother, trying to catch any hint of falsehood. But there was only fatigue and pain in her eyes. John looked at his son. Nick, I understand what you saw, but sometimes what seems obvious isn't true. Nick was breathing heavily. Everything inside was struggling, rage, doubt, disappointment. But somewhere deep down, something else was emerging. Had he really been wrong? Finally, he said hoarsely, I don't know. His voice trembled. I didn't want it to fall apart again. Anna came closer and touched his shoulder. I understand, son, but you have to know, I love you both, and I'm fighting for our family. Nick stood silent. His heart was still beating fast, but the anger was gradually receding, leaving a bitter aftertaste of doubt. He didn't know what to say. I don't want any more lies. She won't be there, Anna said firmly. Days passed, but the anxiety did not subside. Even though Anna explained everything, Nick was gnawed by doubts. Word for word, but what he saw could not leave his head. And he decided he had to find out the truth himself. Nick knew his mother's schedule. She usually left at 8, went to work, and returned in the evening. That morning, he took a day off from college, got on his bike, and keeping a distance, began to follow her car. Anna pulled into the parking lot near her office. Everything was normal. Nick sat in the coffee shop across the street for several hours, occasionally looking out the window. At noon, the office door opened and he saw her. She was walking, not alone. Robert was beside her. They were talking animatedly and smiling. Anna looked relaxed, almost happy. Nick felt a pang of anxiety inside him. But so far, nothing suspicious had happened, just colleagues. Second day, this time Anna didn't come home right after work. Nick waited in the parking lot outside the office until he saw her get into Robert's same black car. He immediately followed. The car drove a few blocks and stopped at a bar. Anna and Robert went inside. Nick went in too, ordering a Coke and sitting down at a distance. His heart was beating fast. They sat at a table in the semi-darkness, talking. Nick saw Robert touch her hand and Anna didn't pull it away immediately. But a second later, she pulled her hand away and shook her head. Her face became serious, even tense. Then they discussed something and she stood up resolutely. Robert remained at the table and Anna went outside. Nick quickly turned away, but his heart was pounding somewhere in his throat. What was it? Rejection? Or doubts? On Friday in the evening, Nick again, but this time everything became even more worse. Anna again didn't leave work alone. She and Robert stopped near its cars and this time he hugged her. It wasn't a quick gesture. The hug was warm, lingering. Nick felt his chest burn from the inside. What? He whispered, feeling his hands clench into fists. He took a step forward but suddenly stopped. His mind was racing. What next? Go up? Make a scene? What if she says again that everything is not as it seems? Suddenly, the phone vibrated in his pocket. It was his father. Nick froze, staring at the screen. He could tell him everything, right now. But something stopped him. Dad, what if I'm wrong again? What if this destroys you completely? He turned off the bell and lowered his head. His heart was beating hard and painfully. Anna returned around 10. She found Nick in the living room. His gaze was dark, heavy. Hello, she said, taking off her coat. Why aren't you sleeping? Where have you been? His voice was almost icy. Anna stopped. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if she had understood something. Niku, were you following me? Yes. His answer was sharp but confident. And I saw everything. Her face tensed. What exactly did you see? How he hugged you. Nick's voice rose sharply. And you didn't push him away right away. Anna exhaled heavily, trying to compose herself. Son, it's not what you think. Again? Same thing again? Nick almost shouted. What else has to happen for this to be what it seems? Anna looked at him, and her voice trembled. Robert, he confessed to me. He said he felt more than friendship for me, but I... Her voice became firmer. I turned him down. Nick looked at her, breathing heavily. So, why were you silent? Because I didn't want to break you and your father up. Her voice broke. I didn't do anything wrong, but I knew you wouldn't believe it. A deep silence fell. At that moment, John appeared in the doorway. He had heard everything. His eyes were dark and his voice was low and heavy. You two should have talked to me before this all turned into hell. Anna looked at him, and there was only fatigue in her eyes. Yes, John, we did, but we've all been afraid of the truth for too long. At night, Nick lay in the dark, but sleep would not come. His mother's words and the insults he could not erase kept replaying in his mind. The kiss, the hug, her voice full of excuses. Pain mixed with hatred. His chest tightened so much that he could barely breathe. He's taking her away from us, he whispered, feeling his anger grow stronger. And then a thought appeared. First as a spark, then as a flame that engulfed the entire mind. If he's gone, everything will come back. She'll stay with us. The family will be whole. His hands clenched into fists. There was a terrifying clarity to this decision. Next days, Nick spent in silent observation. He found out that Robert goes jogging in the park near every morning his her home. Perfect moment. In the evening, he went into the garage and found a heavy wrench. He took it in his hand, feeling the cold metal. His heart pounded in his chest. He took my life. I will take his, he repeated to himself as if it were a spell. The morning was foggy and cool. The park seemed empty, with only the occasional footsteps of joggers. Nick stood behind the tree, the wrench lying heavy in his jacket pocket. His heart was beating dully and fast, but he had no doubt. And here it is, the appearance. Robert ran easily at a steady pace, wearing headphones, completely disconnected from the world. Nick slowly emerged from his hiding place and walked towards him. The distance between them was closing, the seconds seeming like hours. Robert noticed him only a moment before Nick abruptly pulled out the key and swung it with all his strength. What the? Robert only managed to exclaim, but the blow was lightning fast. The sound of metal meeting the temple, the muffled crunch of bone. Robert fell to the ground, and Nick stood over him, breathing heavily. But Robert was still alive. His eyes, full of pain and shock, looked at Nick. And then, he whispered, Why? Nick was choking with anger, but suddenly, his gaze met the victim's. And in those eyes he saw not a threat, not a thief, but a person. You took her from us, Nick exclaimed, but his voice trembled treacherously. Robert, through the pain, croaked, I didn't take anything. She loves you. I helped her. Lies! Nick shouted, but there was more despair than certainty in his voice. Robert coughed, blood coming out of his mouth. His voice was weak, but he continued, She said she was afraid not of me, but of losing you, because of all of that. Nick froze. His hands were shaking. A whirlwind of thoughts was flying through his head. Nick couldn't speak. His throat was tight. The phone fell from his hands. His knees buckled and he fell next to Robert. His chest burned. But now it wasn't the flames of anger, but an icy ball of fear and guilt. What did I do? He whispered, tears rolling down his eyes. And then Nick realized the cracks he wanted to seal have now become a chasm into which he himself has fallen. Meanwhile, Anna was sitting at a table with a friend in a cozy cafe. Sunlight gently falling through wide Anna was sitting at the table opposite the window. Their friend Laura. They just ordered coffee and cakes, talking about work and everyday life things. You look exhausted, Anna, Laura said, looking at her carefully. Still having problems at home? Anna smiled sadly, touching her cup of coffee. Yeah, but I thought things were starting to get better. Nick seemed calmer lately. And suddenly there was a sharp ringing sound. The phone vibrated on the table. The number was unknown. Excuse me, Anna said, picking up the phone. Hello? Is this Anna Miller? The man's formal, cold voice said. Yes, it's me. Who's speaking? Lieutenant Davis, City Police Department. We're sorry to bother you, but your son, Nick Miller, has been arrested. Anna felt her fingers grip the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. What? Arrested? For what? He's accused of assaulting Robert Blake. The victim is in critical condition in the hospital. Your son is at the station. You should come as soon as possible. The coffee in her cup suddenly seemed bitter, and everything around her seemed unreal. Her breathing became ragged. Nick, she blurted out. This is some kind of mistake. I'm afraid not, Mrs. Miller. You can talk to him yourself. Anna was silent, unable to find the words. Nearby, Laura touched her hand with concern. Anna, what happened? Nick, she whispered, wincing as if she had been hit. He's in the police. Laura immediately jumped in. I'll go with you, let's go. Half an hour later, Anna rushed into the station, her face full of horror and anxiety. I'm Anna Miller, she said at the front desk, breathing heavily. My son, Nick Miller, where is he? Lieutenant Davis, a tall man in uniform, approached her. Mrs. Miller, your son is in the holding cell. You can see him. How did this happen? Anna's voice trembled. What did he do? Davis replied grimly. Witnesses say your son attacked Robert Blake in the park. A blunt object was used. Blake is currently in intensive care. Anna felt her legs go numb. She almost stumbled, and Laura helped her up. No, Nick, why? She whispered. Why did he do it? The cell doors opened with a metallic creak. Anna went inside. Nick sat on the bench, his hands handcuffed and his face covered in bruises. His eyes were empty, but when he saw his mother, a flash of pain flashed through them. Mom? His voice was hoarse, broken. Nick! Anna knelt down in front of him, her eyes filling with tears. What have you done? Nick looked away. I wanted to protect us. I saw you with him. I thought... His voice trailed off. You betrayed us again. Anna felt her heart split in half. Oh God, Nick! Her voice trembled treacherously. You've got it all wrong. Her fingers trembled as they touched his cold hands. I refused him. I said I only loved our family. Tears rolled down her cheeks. And you? Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk? Nick shook his head, swallowing back tears. I was blind. I thought I was saving our family. Anna trembled in pain, feeling everything they had built now crumbling. You didn't save us, Nick, she whispered through her tears. You almost destroyed us. And yourself. John arrived later. He saw them, his son behind bars and his wife, broken and devastated. His gaze hardened with anger, despair, and pain. Nick, he said dully, you have done something you can't take back. Nick couldn't look his father in the eye. I know, he whispered. But he had to answer for everything. Nick, her voice broke, but she gathered herself. I can't lie anymore. You have to know the truth. Nick looked at her, tears rolling down his eyes, but there was a cold hardness in his voice. Tell me. Anna shuddered as if something inside was tearing and whispered, I have been dating Robert for a long time. The silence became deafening. It was as if the whole world had stopped. What? Nick flinched, as if her words had hit him harder than a fist. What did you say? Anna clenched her hands, as if trying to keep herself from falling into the abyss. It all started a year ago. At first, it was just conversations. I was lonely. Your father and I, we weren't close anymore. Just fights, emptiness. I, I wasn't looking for this, but she turned away, her voice trembling with shame. I fell in love. No, Nick whispered, feeling everything falling apart inside. You, you betrayed our family? Yes, her voice trembled, but she looked him straight in the eye. But I never wanted to break up the family. I didn't leave because I love you and your father, in my own way. I couldn't ruin your life. You already did it, Nick hissed, pain burning in his eyes. With your lies! Anna bit her lip but didn't look away. I'm not making excuses, Nick. I'm guilty, but I'm still your mother. Nick turned away, his chest heaving. His heart was broken to the core. Why were you silent? Because I was afraid of losing you. Her voice became barely audible. But now I see that by lying, I lost you even more. What did you say? John asked. Anna sharply turned around. There stood John. He heard everything. His face was desolate, and his eyes were as dark as a thunderstorm. His voice was broken. You've been lying to me all this time? Anna froze, as if facing a sentence. John, she began, but he raised his hand abruptly. No, I'm talking now. His voice was low and ragged. All these years, I thought we could still fix this, that it was just a crisis. And you? Nick stood between them, but he felt like the world was falling apart. His gaze darted from his mother to his father. Dad, he tried, but John didn't take his eyes off Anna. You kept it a secret, and even when it all blew up, you let our son do what he did because of your lies. Anna shuddered, her voice breaking into a hoarseness. I never wanted this to happen. But it happened, Anna, John's voice cracked with pain. Your secret almost destroyed our son. Enough, Nick suddenly snapped. His voice echoed loudly off the walls. Enough! You both ruined everything. With your quarrels, with your lies. You both lost me. His chest heaved with heavy breathing, and despair burned in his eyes. You talk about love, about family, and me. Where was I in all this? He rushed forward, his voice filled with pain. You didn't notice me until I became like this, until I took it all on myself. Anna was sobbing. John was silent. His hands were shaking. I can't take it anymore. Nick whispered, feeling his strength leave him. You all destroyed me with your wars. At that moment, the door creaked open and Lieutenant Davis entered the hallway. His face was tense. Time's up. We need to get him back to his cell. Anna fell to her knees. No, please. John was silent, his face stone. Nick looked at them one last time. His voice was quiet, but there was something broken in it. You wanted the truth. Now you have it, but it won't change anything. The police took him by the arms and led him to the exit. Nick! Anna shouted, stretching out her arms, but he didn't even turn around. When the door closed, there was dead silence. Only the ticking of the clock. Anna stood broken like a broken mirror. John! Her voice was barely audible. But John stood still, his eyes blank. It's all over, Anna, he said dully, between us. And without looking at her again, he left, leaving her alone with the ruins. Days after that conversation became a nightmare for Anna. John did not return home. He filed for divorce without any. She received the papers through a lawyer without any hesitation. Personal word. Robert, despite waiting, took away statement from the police. He said he didn't want destroy life, Nick. He's just a guy who was defending what was sacred to him, Robert said shortly. Thanks to this, the case was closed. The police only issued a fine for causing bodily harm, and Anna had to pay it. Nick was released from custody, but he didn't even look at his mother. After his release, Nick returned home, but not to his mother. He was determined to stay with his father. I can't live with you, Mom, he said coldly. You've ruined everything between us. Nick! Anna tried to touch his hand, but he recoiled. There is no more we, his voice was icy. Now there is you. Nick stayed with John, and slowly life began to improve between them. They began to communicate more, cooked dinner together, went fishing, just like they used to do in childhood. John helped Nick return to college and supported him in anger management therapy. Nick got apart, Time job, helping father pay the bills. Anna was left alone. John officially divorced her. Nick stopped all contact. Robert, although he held no grudge, did not want to continue the relationship. Her life was narrowed down to an empty apartment, filled only with the sound of silence. She tried to text Nick. The messages remained unread. She called John. He blocked her number. During this time, Nick graduated from college and started working on his own IT project. John opened a car repair shop where Nick helped him. They celebrated holidays together, built a new life, without Anna. One day, Anna finally dared to come to the garage. She saw John and Nick working together, laughing. They looked happy, and without her, she gathered her courage and approached. Nick. Her voice was quiet, fragile. Can we talk? Nick straightened up, looked at her. There was no more anger in his eyes, but there was no love left either, only coldness and indifference. What do you need, Mom? He asked dryly. I know what I did. I know I lost everything, but I haven't stopped loving you. I want to make things right. Nick was silent. Then he answered briefly and sharply, Too late. Anna felt her heart clench. But I'm your mother? Nick looked her straight in the eye. It was. Maybe I can someday. I can forgive you everything, but not now. Go away, Anna. We don't want to see you anymore. Anna froze, feeling the air grow heavy. Then she lowered her head and slowly walked away, leaving behind only the trail of her footsteps and the pain in her soul. John and Nick, together they built their new life based on truth and trust. Anna was left alone, lost in the shadow of her own mistakes, because the cracks it created were too deep to be patched up.